later on the back half of William's presentation. So I will go into introducing the speaker, which is Mr. William Park. William Park is the president of Pinnacle Construction and Development Corporation, is also the past chairman of the Virginia Tech Program and Real Estate Advisory Board, and a member of the Virginia Housing Development Authority, VHDA, on the Rental Advisory Board. Pinnacle Construction and Development Corporation is a Virginia real estate developer based out of Charlottesville, serving Central Virginia and beyond. Pinnacle combines design, fiscal, which we're going to talk about today, and entitlement processes to their building construction projects. Pinnacle has developed and constructed multi-family projects, commercial, mixed use, medical, historic renovations, and senior living facilities across Virginia. Pinnacle's Virginia construction projects have both won state and national awards for building construction and development excellence. Well done, William. William Park has considerable knowledge of the cost of work in the marketplace and extensive industry experience. His market knowledge allows for the development of highly accurate, market-specific, customized, and finely detailed estimates, which we're going to talk about today, using an extensive database of historical cost and pricing data, as well as market-specific adjustment factors. Again, just as a reminder, folks, please put your questions in the chat for William after. With no further ado, Mr. William Park, you are up, sir.
Hey, Keith, thank you very much and very kind introduction. And first of all, before we get started, just want to make clear, this is not a how to apply workshop for low-income housing tax credits. That would be something else that would probably take us another day or two to go through. But what I'd like to do today is just talk a little bit about affordable housing. What exactly is affordable housing? Potential ways we can finance affordable housing. And then lastly, other potential ways that a locality can partner with the private sector possibly in order to provide affordable housing in that locality. Nick, next slide, please. So just a little background, most everyone knows this, but the land development process, many groups are involved in the land development process. You have the private sector, you've got federal, state, and as our target audience today, localities in order to get the development up and running. Next slide. So as we talk about development, what are some of the costs that go into development? And many of us know what those are, but I thought it would be good just to list some of the costs and the many things that we have to coordinate in order to get a project through. Of course, you've got to have a piece of property to build on. You've got to find that, you've got to acquire it. You've got A&E fees that have to be paid. At the same time, there are other professionals that are involved in the process, appraisers, market analysts, environmental studies that have to be done. And sometimes in the environmental studies, we get into habitat studies, archaeological studies that have to be also carried out. And then, of course, the entitlement process, the rezoning and the site plan. Once we get through that, construction, materials, labor, overhead, and profit, and many of you all that are in construction right now understand materials and what we're going through. For example, I know a lot of our lumber in the past year, our lumber has increased 3 and 4 times as to what we're seeing. Give an example, I was just writing a purchase order the other day that I struggled to sign it. OSB, 7/16 OSB that we use many times for sheathing on our walls and on our roofs. Apartment project, we may have 30,000 sheets of OSB. Typically, I'm in the $10 range. I signed the PO the other day for $42 a sheet. And so that, again, it's one of those things as a developer, I tell everyone, I'm in charge, but I'm not in control. And that's a tough place to be sometimes. And that's a perfect example. Other costs that we have: permits, taxes, insurance, recording fees. Of course, the bank or the lender has their financing fees, other expenses, legal fees, developer fees. Hopefully, after all the fees that I just outlined that there's some left, and then reserves that we have to set aside for working capital and initial operating deficit. Next slide, please. So what are some ways that we typically finance affordable housing? We mentioned banks, credit unions, that's conventional financing, tax-exempt bonds, taxable bonds. Tax-exempt bonds can be induced by economic development authorities, industrial development authorities. Our primary source when utilizing tax-exempt and taxable bonds is going to be the Virginia Housing, as they get a large portion of the tax-exempt bond allocation that goes to the state. The other tool that we use almost extensively for anything below 60% of the area median income is the low-income housing tax credit. And then lastly, any potential grants, federal, state, or local grants. Many times that might be the last piece of the puzzle that we need to make the development work from a financing perspective. Next slide, please. So I mentioned VHDA, or now Virginia Housing, and one of the tools that we've used with Virginia Housing that hits the AMI, area median income, above 60%, where we can only use tax credits, is their mixed income financing. And they have a particular program where they use taxable bonds. 20% would have to be set aside for those tenants at AMI 80% or less. The other 80% could be unrestricted as far as rents, or you can choose the 40-60 option, which would be 40% below 100% AMI and the balance 60% unrestricted. So I thought it was important to show the state housing agency and one of their main sources of financing that we utilize primarily to get that gap between 60 and 100%. Next slide. And then we have tax credits. And as I said earlier, tax credits are the main tool that we use in order to provide housing that's at 60% or less of the AMI. As some of you all know, the investors, if we're allocated tax credits, we sell those tax credits to a corporate entity, and in return, they get a dollar for dollar credit against a federal tax liability. Also, they utilize, since tax credits are a loss, when we syndicate the project, they get the benefit of any other losses, which would be, of course, depreciation and interest. Tax credits, or low-income housing tax credits, are taken over a 10-year period and they're subject to recapture, however, with the IRS over a 15-year period. So that's something important to note. Next slide. So this is a little flow chart we put together, and this is just an example of what I just talked about. Of course, you have the developer in the middle that's trying to provide affordable housing. You apply for tax credits to the state allocating agency, which in this case is Virginia Housing. The credits are allocated to you as a developer. You then sell the tax credits to the syndicator and or the investor. In return, equity is provided to the project. That equity is put into the deal. And then, of course, to top it off, the equity is not going to provide all the source that you need. So you still need a lender to provide some debt. Next slide. And this talks about a little bit, again, what the investor and what we look for. As I said, the investor in exchange, once the credits are allocated to the project, the equity, the credits are then sold to the investor. The equity is put into the project, which that means it lowers the debt. In order to lower the debt, we can meet the lower rent thresholds that we have signed on to due to the tax credit program. And then the tax credit, the tax benefits to the investor will be the tax credits over 10 years. And then in years 11 through 15, they also take advantage of the tax losses through the depreciation and interest expense. Next slide, please. So thought I would stick in a sample pro forma here. This is a project we did in another locality 3 or 4 years ago where we utilized tax exempt bonds. And in that case, and I won't get bogged down into the details today, but there are two types of low-income housing tax credits, a 9% tax credit and a 4% tax credit. The 9% credit is essentially more than twice what the 4% credits are if you do the math. In doing so, though, the 9% credits are very competitive, and you have to go through a competitive process with Virginia Housing once a year in order to obtain these credits, whereby if you use tax-exempt bonds, you automatically get tax credits through the 4% tax credit allocation. However, that's only half of what the 9%, so many times other sources are needed in order to make the project work. So in this case, this is a project where if you look at the sources, tax credit equity going in was a little over 5 million. The tax exempt bonds on the debt side were close to 5 million. VHDA also provided some low interest money through their REACH program at 2.5%. The locality provided a contribution, and this was more or less an in-kind contribution. They reduced tap fees for us and then allowed the utilization of a regional stormwater pond that was there. And the value of that ended up being close to $600,000. And then we had deferred developer fees in order to top off the sources there. Uses, acquisition cost, construction cost. You can see the A&E fees that we talked about previously, financing costs, carrying costs, which primarily are interest, insurance, and our reserves. We still had locality permit and other fees that we paid on top of it. And then we had the developer fees less the deferred developer fees. And I might just add one of the things here that you see when you're doing these projects, the developer fees are typically your contingency also. So your motivation there, certainly you run into things many times. The developer fee is your contingency until you have the project built and stabilized. Next slide, please. So I stuck this slide in because what I hear, you hear the term affordable housing so many times, and it, quite frankly, is a little bit of a misunderstood concept. What I think is affordable housing may be different than what some of you all think is affordable housing, but it affects a wide range of people. And I think over the years when the low-income housing tax credit was first promulgated, one of the things, the worst things they ever did was entitle it the low-income housing tax credit, because I think at that point everybody thinks you're talking about people that don't work, that have no other chance to I think provide anything to society, which is totally wrong. Affordable housing, as you can see, and we put photos of people here, many of our first responders that are out there, many of our teachers, many of our service workers fit within what affordable housing is today. And one of the difficult things is that these people are never represented so many times. And when I say represented, especially during the entitlement process, because during the entitlement process, many times it can be controversial. When it is, what happens to people that it's ultimately going to benefit, since it's not up and running, they're not able to, or they don't know to come out and speak in favor of it. And many times you have the surrounding neighborhoods that speak against what you might be doing when it's going to benefit people in your community. So I think one of the unfortunate things is that many of the people that benefit from this are never represented early on when you're trying to develop the project. Next slide, please. So just briefly, this is a slide I won't spend too much detail on, but what does affordable housing mean? What does it mean when we say 60% of the area median income? As you can see, the about middle way down to the left, Charlottesville area, family of four or four-person household, the median income is $93,900, which is a big number. Many people don't realize that. And so when we're looking at tax credit compliance, if we base this on a family of four, that equates to $56,340. And then as we go through the calculations in the tax credit program, you can see what that means at 60%, 70%, and 80% for a 1, 2, and 3 bedroom for maximum rents. And I just put that in today. I won't go into too much detail, but that's what we have to work back to in order to make sure a project meets the financial benchmarks that it has to meet. Next slide, please. So I thought this would be an interesting slide. So what does this mean? So we did a little research, and looked at the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, Fluvanna, Greene, Nelson, and what are some of the annual wages for people that work for these localities. So if you think about the slide that I just had before and the income range, and you look at the annual wages here, you will see when we see say affordable housing, many of people that are or jobs that fit within that range. So I won't sit here, you all can read this, I won't sit here and talk about every one of them, but I think it certainly drives home the point that many of your neighbors qualify to live in affordable housing. And so again, I challenge everyone here, when we're done with the presentation, you go back, look at this slide and the one before to get a good feel of who benefits from affordable housing. Next slide, please. So along the way, we've been doing this about 30 years, and we just thought, okay, what are some of the areas where we see the process breaks down to provide affordable housing? And one of the areas we see is just, for lack of a better term, excessive or sometimes obsolete controls that were put in place, meaning zoning requirements that were put in place 10, 15, 20 years ago that just don't apply now. And as I just mentioned, it's unfortunate, but we have the NIMBY attitudes and the intervention during the entitlement process. Another thing that's difficult in many localities is to find a parcel where we can build the multifamily housing, because land is limited, zoning may not allow it, infrastructure may not be to the site. So that's a big issue. And then of course, taxes and fees of such that that might preclude us from doing the development. So those are four large or main items we've seen over the years that has a significant impact on the process. Next slide, please. So what are some of the solutions or some of the areas possibly where we can obtain financing to provide affordable housing? Well, again, the biggest one that's been out there since 1986 that is used all the time is the low-income housing tax credit. And I think you could see by the sample pro forma that we put in there, that was a 4% tax credit deal. Most of the time when you have a 4% deal, your loan to value, loan to cost is going to be less than 60%. When you have a 9% deal, which usually skews rents even lower than the 60% range, many times you'll probably be in the 30 or 40% loan to value. And if you think about that, that's what you would need to be in order to lower your debt service in order to get the lower rents. State enterprise zone and opportunity zone benefits. State enterprise zone may come into play if you have a mixed use deal where you have commercial. Opportunity zones, not quite as much benefit because you're syndicating the low income credits, but what it does enable a locality to do that if potentially we're building in an opportunity zone, it may allow the locality to provide more benefits, density bonus or something like that, just due to the fact that the locality has targeted this as an opportunity zone. So as I said, it may give them the opportunity to do some things that they really hadn't thought about in the past. Grants are always important. Usually the grants, that's usually the last little tranche of financing that you would need to get over the top. Below market rate interest financing, as I said, one of the funds that we use the most is the REACH financing from VHDA, which is below 3%. They'll usually mix that in with the taxable or tax exempt financing to drive your interest rate down. 35-year amortization. If you use a HUD D4 program, you could get out to 40-year amortization. All those things lower your debt service so you could get your rents down. We mentioned tax exempt bond financing, which automatically gets you the 4% credit, which is very important. And then all of this leads to favorable mortgage terms, which whether it's the interest rate, the amortization, or both, you have to spread that debt service out. And then sometimes you have interest-only loans for a certain period of time also. Next slide, please. So then we kind of get to the punchline. What are some of the ways affordable housing can be, I guess, helped by the localities? Well, one of the ways, if a locality has land that is not being utilized, as we mentioned before, one of the limiting factors to providing affordable housing is finding the parcel. So does a locality have land that they can donate? Also, real estate tax incentives. Is there, if you think about it, our rents are capped, so we can't increase rents. Expenses, no matter what, we have to pay insurance, we have to pay our people, we have operating expenses. What is the one expense that a locality controls is the real estate tax. So is there a way that there's a performance agreement that can be put in place that we will waive real estate taxes or keep them at a certain rate if the developer keeps a project affordable for a certain period of time? Housing choice voucher program, of course, this is rental assistance. It's really tough to get any new rental assistance. Usually that is utilized when we're really skewing our rents deep down to the 40 and 30% AMI range. And you just need rental vouchers in order to make the deal work. Density bonuses, which of course Albemarle County has, other localities have, and you know, this we can also call that inclusionary zoning. And as long as it's voluntary and not mandatory, that's a good way to encourage or incentivize the developer to offset the lower rents they're going to get, possibly by having higher density. One of the things we see many times, though, when there's higher density, yes, you're allowed the density, but the density may break down because of the parking requirements. So you have to look at that, I think, a little more holistically to say, okay, you can't just do density. What else is it? Or building height may prevent us from achieving that density. So when you say density bonus, I think make sure the locality looks at the parking requirements and height requirements. And this goes part and parcel with subdivision rules and regulations, road width, curbing, materials, you know, a little bit more minor, but something we deal with from time to time. And the next one is a big area where I think a locality could really help is if someone's bringing you an affordable deal, is there some way to do expedited review? And not just from a site plan standpoint, but from an entitlement review standpoint, because when we're dealing with tax credits, it's a very, you've got a house of cards here as you've got a number of other financing sources you're trying to keep together. And the more this gets drug out, the harder it is to make the deal go through. So is there a way to speed up the entitlement? Is there a way when site plan is turned in that, okay, it's an affordable housing deal, so we, the county or the city, we guarantee that your initial review will happen within 7 days or 14 days or something like that. So we have a timeline that we can work with. So that, again, another area I think the county could and city could really step up and help out. And the next one is one that we see from time to time, but I think, again, that goes part and parcel with what we just talked about in the one before, that the planning staff needs to be an advocate and really help get us through the process for this affordable housing, because time is money. And if we're sitting there with a deal that we've looked at and the interest rate needs to be 5%, and all of a sudden this thing is taking 8 or 9 months to get through, and now interest rates are 6%, well, the deal may not work anymore. And that's the reality of it. And then, of course, other fees a locality could possibly waive, just like I showed in that pro forma before, whether it's, you know, application fees or somewhat nominal in the scheme of things, but building permit fees. But one of the biggest fees out there that we run into is the water and sewer tap fees. And I realize sometimes there's an authority that's separate from the locality, but it seems like there could be better conversation that these authorities could work with the county and city to find some way to possibly reduce fees, especially if the infrastructure is already there. Next slide, please. Okay, I guess that's the end of it. I couldn't even remember how many slides we had, Keith, but anyway, sorry, I rushed through that pretty quick. It's you know, affordable housing is something we could talk about for days here, but I'm certainly available to try to answer any questions.
So William, I'm going to kick it off. Thank you for your presentation, and you know, we've got a bunch of time now for some Q&A, which is a good thing. So we have over 50 some odd people watching. I perused some of the names that I watched. Some folks I know, some I do not know. But for the folks that are not in our world, can you do me a favor and explain the word entitlement? So the folks that are not in this world and not understanding or not part of the process on a regular basis, what does entitlement, what does that consist of? And then as a follow-up to that, I'm gonna kind of toot my own horn a little bit. I'm part of a cohort that's put on in Portland State University that we're working in Portland and in Seattle. And what they have done in their affordable housing project, very similar to what you just outlined, there's a very specific checklist. And what they have done is they've assigned a specific staff member to each particular project. So instead of going from one staff member who covers one facet of the entitlement, and sometimes you get handed over, and they reduce that red tape substantially. So I'm just going to kick it off with that question and see what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first of all, when I say entitlement, that means rezoning, just to be clear. So if we have an application for rezoning, where the difficult part comes in is what's required nowadays, Keith. It used to be some years ago that if I'm rezoning for a multifamily project, we would generally show, okay, here's what we think we're building, and that would be a rectangle. We would say, okay, we know we have to meet certain parking requirements. We know we have to meet height requirements and so forth. What's happened now is we almost have to have a full site plan for approval before we can even apply for rezoning. And what that means is we have to have the building engineered. We have to show where all the utilities are, the stormwater. We have to do, many times we have to do traffic studies, environmental studies. So essentially what that means is it takes an inordinate amount of time, and you're spending a lot of money for things that could be handled in the site plan process. So not only does it cost a lot, but what that does, that's a barrier to entry, maybe to other or more developers that would like to do affordable housing, because they don't have the capital in order to even start the entitlement process, which is very difficult. And I said, if many of these items are handled in the site plan process and should be handled administratively. So I think that's one of the things we've seen over the years, that the entitlement process is getting longer and longer, more and more expensive, and it's just so much risk out there that it's a whole lot of money that if you don't get the rezoning, then that's all money that you've wasted. So, that's my take on it from a rezoning perspective.
So, William, I'm going to jump in on a couple of questions on the feed, and Brandon Collins asked the question, at what point does lower rents make the development costs fall apart? So that's kind of coming along with what you just responded. Is there some magic point that this just all falls apart?
No, there's no magic, because every locality is different, right? I mean, because if you look at it from an affordable housing standpoint, and when I'm talking generally. So if you take area median income for Charlottesville at 93,000 versus maybe I go over in the mountain and it's Stanton, and I'm just doing off the top of my head, and it's 75,000, yet my construction costs are the same. So my rents are going to be lower. So I have to look at that a whole lot differently than I do in Albemarle, meaning, okay, I've got to make sure going in that tap fees are even less, or land is even less, or we may need to get other benefits from the locality because the rent structure is just not there, but my cost might be the same from a building perspective in Albemarle as it is in the Valley or in Southside Virginia if I'm doing a smaller project. Of course, a smaller project is less efficient than a larger project. So it's hard for me to say that there's any, okay, it gets to a certain number per unit or a certain percentage where it blows up. I can't, if it was that easy, I guess I'd be doing it all the time, right?
So just to add to that a little bit, and I'm sure that you're aware of this and the rest of the panelists may or may not be aware of this, but in the city of Charlottesville, I chair the Thomas Jefferson Community Land Trust, and they actually do reduce the connection fees substantially. I believe it's $800 for water and $800 for sewer, just to get that information out there. A question from Neil Williams. Do you find most localities and their neighbors are receptive to affordable housing? So I guess the question is what localities do you find are more receptive to the process? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think we have to differentiate between is the localities and the neighbors.
Sure.
Okay, because and it's been a real shift over the last 10 years. I think we did our first tax credit deal in 1991. Okay, during the time period, I mean, I have been in rezonings where, and it's hard to believe this, people have stood up, gone to the lectern and said, we don't want these type of people living next to us. That's hard to believe, but I have been there when that has happened. And I'm just, I'm just going, are you serious? And it's real interesting that back in the day when he did that, many of those people who stood up were people that actually made, they were at the AMI level that they could have lived there, which is kind of interesting. What I've seen though as a locality, I've seen more and more localities now they understand affordable housing better. They see the need for affordable housing, especially when you have a situation where the jobs are in a locality, but the affordable housing is 2 counties away, and someone has to get up at 5 in the morning and drive, and just the cost there to do that, right? So, but then we get to the entitlement process and we find a piece of property where we want to get it rezoned, irrespective of even whether it's affordable or not, then everybody comes out of the woodwork to say we don't want it here. And I don't know if we can ever change that. So I think it's very important to differentiate between, yes, I do see more localities who are focusing more on affordable housing and really care about affordable housing. But what's got to happen when it gets in the rezoning process, the city council, the boards of supervisors have to be able to stand up there and look out across and see 100 of their neighbors who don't want it, but yet the comprehensive plan says this is something that they want. The rezoning that we're doing, we check all the boxes. And if we do that, then I think they need to say, look, I'm sorry, but this is what we say we need and want as a county. This is a good location. So we're going to vote for it. And they just have to do it.
So William, along those lines, we have Councilor Michael Payne joining us. So thank you, Councilor Payne. I think Councilor Lloyd is also joining us. Along those lines, what can localities do to reduce the land cost piece in affordable housing development? In full disclosure, I chair the Community Land Trust. Can the Community Land Trust model substantially help? Of course, I'm going to say yes. Getting affordable housing from a development standpoint. So before you answer that question, William, for those who are not familiar with the land trust model, the land trust retains the land and then the developer would develop. So I think the question is if there's a project in the city where the land is owned by the land trust, so there's 0 basis points to you on that, and then you can develop on top of it. Does that make sense as a potential solution, or what I refer to as maybe 1 or 2 of the silver buckshot pellets, not a silver bullet?
Absolutely. And that was one of as a locality in my little list that I had there, and that goes hand in hand. I mean, it's the same thing as land donation, right? If you can help provide the land, that is usually a big cost to the project, no doubt about it.
So the difference is that the land trust controls that it'll be forever there's a deed restriction on the property that the project would be forever affordable versus certain period of time. So let me buzz through some questions here. Just bear with me. Let me see. So I apologize, I can't read the first and last name, but if there's a project that's already has city approval, the land has been acquired, and there's already an investor / syndicator, but the project needs secure financial gap, what's to create an economic basement just in case? Are grants the best way to fund that, or are other funding? I guess they're asking, what are your funding sources to do this, assuming the land is acquired and so forth and so on. Does that make any sense to you, sir?
Okay, so the question is, what are the funding sources for an affordable deal? Is that what I'm hearing? Or was it if you put your deal together and then all of a sudden interest rates have gone up or the syndication proceeds are less than what you thought?
I have a feeling it's a little of both. If you could tackle it the best way you can, and we'll jump on to another question.
Well, I think Right, and that's the problem with development. Like I said earlier, we're in charge, but we're not in control. So you may have a situation. I'll give you a classic example. When we had one of the elections and taxes were cut, well, when taxes were cut, that had a negative impact on the pricing of tax credits because corporations didn't need credits as much. So it's just a supply and demand issue. So we were in the middle of a deal where maybe we had pro forma'd 85 cents on the dollar to sell the tax credits. And then overnight or within a week, it dropped to 75 cents. Well, that doesn't sound like much, but that probably was $1.5 million on this particular project, right? Just because of the syndication aspect of it. So the only thing, and if you think about it, if you lose equity, the only thing you can replace it with is debt. So now what you need is either a soft loan that you can forgive, where that's something the city might be able to step up and say it's interest only, or it's forgiven at some point in time. Or, as I said before, you can borrow more money if your expenses go down. That gives you a better debt service coverage. So maybe real estate taxes, that's something that the county can or the city can work with you in order to say, okay, we'll set aside or hold taxes at whatever the current land value is, not on the improvements. So I think the locality just has to be open to see what they can do to help out.
So we're going to change directions a little bit, and a question from Christopher Bremet. How do you prospect for opportunities? How much of your determination is based on community need versus revenue opportunity versus ease of working with the locality? So I guess what Christopher's trying to ask is what is your pre-game process before you move forward on a project?
Yeah, so first I'm probably going to answer that in reverse order. I think as far as the community value, one of the things we like to say in here, we can do well by doing good, right? So if we're able to use some of these programs where, and just to make it clear, I've never said I'm the benevolent developer, but at the same time, if we can make a living and do something that benefits the community, then I think at the end of the day, that benefits everyone. And what localities have to realize is that if the money doesn't go to this locality, it's going to go to another locality. So you might as well try to work with the developer, if you like the project, to try to get this money, because it's going to go to someone else who could potentially be competing with you. Okay. So as far as prospecting, fortunately for us, we've been doing it a long time. So we have a number of brokers that know what we do that come to us. We have our own staff here that, just because we have a number of projects around the state, we know areas where we think there's demand. If we think there's demand, we do our in-house market study. Then we hire a third-party market analyst. And then once we substantiate that, then we go look at the locality's comprehensive plan. And what does their comprehensive plan say? Does it actually say that housing is a major issue? Affordable housing is a major issue? Does it say that we encourage private-public partnerships to work to provide affordable housing? And if we see that in the comp plan, then we go, okay, this is a locality that is serious about affordable housing. And so it's an iterative process to get there. But it's really interesting. I get asked that question a whole lot. Well, how do you all find a site to do this? And I think part of it is we've been doing it for a long time, but part of it is we bird dog a lot of sites. That's just what we do. It's not easy.
No, it's not, because it's just a whole bunch of boxes you have to check, and if any one of them goes sideways on you, the deal just falls apart. I'm going to ask a question from Susan Steinmart, who's the Executive Director of the Community Land Trust. Can you share more information about tap fees and what they are typically? So we just discussed the city of Charlottesville, if you're affordable housing, and it's substantially reduced. I think it's important for the panel, for the participants, to understand what that really equals to in a multifamily project. So let's just say you're doing 125 unit apartment complex, just to pick a number. In certain jurisdictions, what would that connection fee be?
I mean, we see connection fees anywhere from $3,000 to $15,000 a unit, right? And obviously you get to a place where it's $15,000 a unit, it just doesn't work, right? And so multiply that. I mean, even I could do that math, Keith, times 100, and you start looking at it, and right, and it's a big deal. It is a huge deal. And those fees many times are paid up front at closing. So it's not unusual. We'll see a deal that all of a sudden we look at and go, wow, that's $800,000 in tap fees. So the first thing we ask when we see a property, we ask if it's a broker that brings it to us, the first thing we ask is, what are the tap fees, right? And it used to be, we had two questions. Are there proffer fees and are there tap fees? And many times when you added those together, it made the value of the land negative, if that made sense, right? It might, the piece of property might be valued at 10,000 a unit, but the tap and proffer fees were 15,000 units. So essentially the landowner, if they want to do multifamily, they had a negative value on the property.
But along those lines, so let's assume you're in a locality, just for simple math, because that's just the way my brain operates. There's a $10,000 water and sewer connection fee, and let's say, like the city of Charlottesville, they drop it to, I believe it's 800 on both sides, so call it $1,600. That's a direct flow down to the per door, right? And in the multifamily world, it's per door is usually how these things are calculated. So therefore, you could.
Yeah, sorry, Keith, let me interrupt. So you're exactly right. So let's just say it's $800,000. Well, now that's $800,000 you don't have to get debt service on. Sure. So just go ahead and take 800,000 times 5% times 30 years and see what that amounts to, right? And then so that's where this really comes into play. So as I said, if a locality reduces that level of fees, if they provide the land, and then lastly, if you need to, if they're able to help with the real estate taxes, then you can put a deal together. And those are really at the end of the day, if we take away anything from this 1 hour, that's really the three major items where a locality can really help with affordable housing.
So I think it's worth repeating those three takeaways, if you wouldn't mind, please.
I'm sorry, say that again, Keith?
Yeah, could you repeat those three takeaways, the three takeaways that you would like for the folks to take away from this that you just mentioned? I think it's worth repeating.
Well, we talked about fees, right? Tap fees. We talk about land, if they're able to donate land, and then we talk about real estate taxes.
Got it.
Okay. And all those, if the county or the locality is able to work with you, that helps with your pro forma in order to make the deal work. Because you've got to realize we're limited on the rents, especially if it's a tax credit deal. HUD puts those rents out once a year, and that's what your rents are for the year. You cannot go over those rents.
So let's talk a little bit about, and I'll go back to the questions here in a moment, but let's talk about for lack of a better term, I use tax incentives from the localities. Talk about that process a little bit for those who are not familiar how that works and what the end results could be. So in other words, if you have an abatement of a period of time, how does that flow directly towards the rent, the per month rent?
Yeah. So what we've been successful with some localities is we would structure a performance agreement, right? So we're saying if we don't perform, then we're going to pay the real estate taxes based on the improvements. If we do perform, then we're going to keep the taxes for whatever the 15-year compliance period. We're going to keep the taxes at what the land is valued at now. Okay. And because what happens, the process is going to be that we've got to be able in year 15 that now we've paid down some of the debt service, and now it's going to go to assessment. Now we're going to start assessing the improvements. Now, what we don't want to do is in year 15 to year 16 go from 0 to 100%, because that probably is going to be more than what the project can withstand. So what we've done in the past with other localities, we get to year 16, it's 20% assessment. 40% at year 17 until you get to year 20 where you have full assessment. Now, during that 5-year period, we have paid down debt, and now we can go back and refinance the deal and recast that debt over a new 30-year period. So now my debt service has gone down. The lower debt service, the difference between what I was paying, what I'm paying now in the refinance will be used to pay the taxes on the new assessment on the improvements. So, and see, because understand, we have to be able to sell this to the bank or the VHDA or to HUD, whoever we're working with, because the first question they're going to ask Mr. Developer, well, in year 15, what are you going to do when you have to start paying taxes on this? So we have to show a plan that we can work our way to this. And at the end of the day, we can show that if the locality never did anything, that they're going to get X amount of taxes on a unimproved land versus if you take it over a 25 to 30 year period, you're going to end up with a whole lot more taxes than you had, plus you provided affordable housing. So again, that's a way we can work together from a private public standpoint.
Pivot a little bit to time, right? The cost of money and how long does this process take in different jurisdictions? But you know, what would an expedited time frame look like in your perspective? Like, I'll give you an example. I'm a recovering developer. First project I did in the 80s. It took me 6 or 9 months to get through the process, entitlement, and move forward. Talk a little bit about the cost of time versus a project and how it impacts the affordability of it.
Well, so two things. First of all, we assume on an expedited review, because if I'm the reviewer, I'm going to say, well, yeah, that's fine, but you need to send me a complete application, right? Because there are going to be people that turn in an application that's halfway, and that happens, right? So I'm not picking on anybody, any reviewer anywhere, but I would think we've got a checklist, which most localities do. You look at this checklist and we assume we turn everything in. The initial review needs to, I don't see any reason why the initial review couldn't happen in a couple of weeks, right? Or let's just say at the latest 30 days. So that initial review, assuming we put in a complete application, we could get that initial review back on any concerns or questions. And at that point, the ball's in our court, right? To answer the questions that came back. And it should be that the more specific we were or the better job we did when we turned in an application would be that it shouldn't be that many comments when it comes back. And look, we live in somewhat of a subjective world, right? So I think it really depends on staff, that the staff is trained in such a way that, hey, here's what we're trying to do objectively, here's what we're trying to do, and try not to put in your subjectiveness or to go, oh, it would be nice if they did this, right? That's sometimes where we get bogged down. So, I mean, I mean, this is a little bit punitive maybe on the reviewer side, but if we say, look, it has to be reviewed in 30 days or 45 days or whatever they come up with, well, if it doesn't get reviewed, then that means it's passed. That gives everybody incentive there, right? So I don't know. The bottom line is time is money, and we have to work together. We need to turn in a complete application, but that, especially that initial review, it needs to be done quickly and get back to us because we're just sitting here.
Well,
and we
William,
can't really, we can't do anything till we get feedback.
Well, I understand that, William, but I will tell you to take the side of the reviewers. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with them where the incomplete applications is a norm. Yep. Is a norm. So we need to understand that and accept that as a reality in it. So we're at 12:51. I may have missed a question, but if anybody has any further questions for William that I haven't covered, please drop them into the feed. Does any staff members of the community, Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, have any questions for Mr. Park? Maybe Nick or somebody else?
I don't have a question, but I think there's two that were in the chat that maybe we didn't quite get to. One was a clarification of an earlier question about what's the best funding source for filling financial gaps once the land is secured and the syndicator is secured. I would assume grants, but wanted to get your insight.
Well, I know DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, they have some grant or funding money in there that can be utilized from time to time. You know, VHDA may have some money too. And that's always a tough question, right? At what point, how much money are you putting in before you know if you really have a project or not? And that's where the time frame gets to be an issue. So again, I would say DHCD or VHDA are your primary sources that they have something. Some of the syndicators, if you're a nonprofit, they may have some money that they work with you on just for initial expenses, but that's been my experience from what I've seen, Nick.
And then just one final question that I see in the chat was from Chris, who employs a number of employees making between that $33,000 and $50,000 annual salary. He wanted to know if he should start showing up and advocating for his staff at some of these zoning meetings.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think so. The more people know about that, and that's what happens in the entitlement process. The people that are going to benefit from this housing are not there at the rezoning. And so they don't have a voice, or they don't know about it, or there's no one to coordinate to say, hey, we could use this housing. And I think the more we had people like that speak, it would make a difference when we get in these public hearings. Absolutely.
Thank you, Nick, for catching the questions I missed. I apologize for that. So if there's no other questions, William, I want to thank you for your time, for coming in and doing this. This is a pretty high level topic, and you made it digestible. So thank you very much. I want to do another shout out to our sponsors on this. Let me see. I got a question come in. Let's see while we got a little bit of time here. No, it was a kudos. So thank you, Lance, for that. So I just wanted to thank Virginia National Bank one more time for sponsoring this. They're excellent partners, and I believe, Lucinda, you are going to wrap up the meeting. Once again, thank you so much, William. You were outstanding. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure being here, Keith. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to everybody who came today. And we also want to thank the Central Virginia Regional Housing Partnership, William Park from Pinnacle Construction Development Corporation, and Keith Smith, the chair of the CVRHP. A recording of the event and the previous event, Zoning Hurdles and Incentives, will be available on our website next week. We'll also have the slides available. And please consider registering for our last two spring events. On May 20th, we have transportation and housing, and on June 17th, there will be equity and housing. The topic will be equity and housing. So thanks, everybody.
And there will be a survey. It says Gretchen, but I think that was Nick was going to tackle that one.
Yeah. Actually, let's put that in the chat box right now.
So please take these surveys. They're super helpful for creating future series. We have I believe, over 50 people watching, which is awesome. So please fill out the survey. It helps us formulate our next series of discussions. William, I think we're going to cut everybody loose here. As a chairman, I'd like to get things done on time. So William, thank you very much again for your time. Thank you to the Planning District Commission staff. I got the easy thing. I just show up and do this. Those guys are the ones that really make the magic happen. So please give a little bit of clap out to them in the chat box, because without that team, we wouldn't be doing this. So I wish everybody a great day. I think we're moving on, right, guys? Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again,
Thanks,
William.
everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.